Hello, dear friends. I have made a number of recordings in the past, but I've never uploaded them to YouTube about my own personal experience with the 2x2s, growing up in the 2x2s and so forth. Basically, an autobiography, a 2x2 autobiography. I never upload them because, frankly, my story is not interesting. It's really and of no value to you, the listener. But sometimes I reflect on my story, my autobiography, and I think that there might be actually be some nuggets in there that are useful. So one nugget, and I referred to this in one of my prior podcasts, was that I never joined the two by twos as a child. And I started thinking about that some more, and there's a lot more that we could peel away there that will explain what a what happens in a two by two childhood. Okay, so just bear with me. So if you grew up in a two by twos, and I don't mean really recently in the last 10, 15 years, because it's quite different now. But certainly in the heyday of the two by twos, right? The 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s even. You had no television, okay? No radio for most of them, and no television, no exposure to popular music, right? No sports. You weren't allowed to participate in sports with other kids. Any kind of after school activities, whatever it would be, drama club, whatever, it doesn't matter. You couldn't participate, right? The only thing you could do with other kids was go to public school, be in the classroom, which of course there's teachers there talking, so you can't really socialize with other kids. And then you had maybe the 1 hour at recess to socialize. And then you got on the bus or walked home or whatever, and that was it. That was your exposure to other children, except for other two by two kids who then you would see, in the evenings at Wednesday meetings or on the weekends or something like that, or at convention. So basically, your exposure to non two by two children was extremely limited. Okay, so your ability as a child then to become socialized, to develop an ability to fit in with non two by two children was extremely limited. And the added effect of not having access to a television or music or radio made it even worse. That meant that the non two by two childhood experience that 99% of the other kids that you went to school with were experiencing, you didn't experience that. You were unable to fit in with them. And so you would immediately become a potential object of ostracization by the other children, right? You can imagine like that the homecoming queen and homecoming king were never going to select you to be their date, okay? No chance. You were a weirdo. Okay? Everybody knew you were something weird about you. You might not have been as weird as the fat kid who picked his nose or whatever, but there was something off with you. Okay? Everyone in the school knew that. And it was only you were always walking a fine edge between sort of fitting in and being downright ridiculed and ostracized and excluded. And that's very important because that's the path to all kinds of other psychological pathologies. If you become excluded from the other kids, you will become your need for social connection with other kids becomes curtailed and you start to develop pathologies. Okay? Depression, anxiety, same-sex attraction, all kinds, trannies, whatever, a whole litany of things get set in motion when you have this improper socialization mechanism going on. And just think back to some of the kids in your school who were severely picked on, who were severely ostracized, and how they turned out in life. Obviously, not good, right? Some of them turned out to be serial killers, some of them turned out to be drug addicts, whatever. But I can assure you that that ostracization in your childhood by other kids is a road to ruin. Okay? So for two by two kids, every two by two kid was on that road. Some were on it deeper and some were on it lesser. Okay? And what I mean by that, some of the parents of two by two kids allowed their children to participate in some things. Maybe they got to play a sport after school, one sport a year. Maybe they got to participate in one activity whatever. Maybe the parents had some non two by two friends and allowed those children of those friends to socialize with your friends. Maybe you had some non two by two relatives who had kids your age that you could socialize with. Whatever those little windows were, those were windows to exposure to the non two by two world, and those were windows to learn how to socialize yourself so that you wouldn't be ostracized by the general population of your peers. Okay? Now, some kids, two by two kids, their parents were extremely strict two by twos, and basically they only allowed their children to expose to other two by twos. And those are the kids that had they were on the most extreme form of lack of socialization and therefore the highest propensity to have all these other mental pathologies come on to them later in life. Okay, so now how does that relate to myself? In my self case, I had extreme. My parents were very strict two by twos. Let's put it that way. And most of my relatives were two by twos. Though I did have some relatives who were not, and and those people did have some children who were my age, and I was able to socialize with those children for a couple of weeks per year. And that was a massive window for me to learn how to be a child that wasn't a weirdo. And I could then parlay that into my behavior at school. And so I could try to fit in. The other thing was I had some relatives who lived relatively close by and had a television. So every once in a while I could go there and I could watch some television shows and I could at least get the general idea of what some of these television programs that my peers were talking about, right? So when they said whatever XYZ television show, I knew I could say, yeah, these characters, yeah, yeah. The other thing was that I, at a very young age, like probably by age 6, I was acutely aware of this potential for ostracization, and I knew I had to fit in. And there were other two there, there were some other two by two kids in my school, a couple, and they didn't make any effort to fit in. They just were like proudly indoctrinated that two by twoism was the way to go. They were better than everyone else. Okay, so they of course became objects of ostracization. Now I think cleverly distanced myself from those students. I wanted nothing to do with them. I didn't even I pretended that I didn't even know them, never seen them before in my life. And the reason was I didn't want to be tainted by them. I didn't want to be infected with their propensity for ostracization. And the other thing was that I took every opportunity I could to um, to fit in, right? And one of the things I would do was that I would read the newspaper every week and look at the TV guide, and I would read the little summaries of the television shows that my peers were interested in, and so I could at least say, in this television program on this episode of this week, this is kind of basically what happened. Now, I wouldn't, obviously, it's like a 30-minute or 1 hour program. I wouldn't know everything about it, but I would know the general gist of the concept. And therefore, I could at least mention a few things in a conversation with other peers at school, and I didn't appear to be like completely out of my mind. So that was very useful. I tried my very best to get a computer when I was a child so that I could at least play some computer games, and then I could, some of my friends had at school had computer games, so at least I had that. I could talk with them. Whatever interests my friends at school had, if some of them were like interested in, I don't know, fishing or something like that, I would say, oh well, I'm interested in, I would make sure to learn everything I could about fishing. They're interested in, like, I don't know, bicycles. I learn everything about bicycles, whatever. I worked extremely hard to develop knowledge base so that I could fit in as best as I could, right? I did everything I could to be as non two by two as I could. I'll even say that, like, look, when my parents would go to meetings and they'd take me along with them, and we'd stop in town, I wouldn't get out of the car uh, if I saw any of my fellow peers anywhere near us. I didn't want them to see me dressed as I was, meeting clothes on, with a meeting bag, going into someone's house or whatever, gossip me or whatever. I didn't want anybody to know I was associated with this. I didn't want anyone to know that my family was involved with this business, okay, with this two by two business. It's just a bad situation. I didn't need this additional risk of social ostracization. Okay, so everything in my childhood was to fit in, to be, to avoid being this ostracization, and that assisted me greatly in my personality development because I wasn't ostracized basically by my peers. I did fit in, I did have friends, and so forth. I didn't develop any of these massive pathologies that so many other people I know who've been in a two by two homes did, right? That's the key thing. And that's why, when I'm talking in some of these podcasts and I'm talking about this two by two over there, this X two by two over here, and I saying, this person's a tranny, or this person thinks they're bisexual, or this one is grooming their children into homosexuality or whatever, you can see I'm talking about people who have mental pathologies. Like, I don't know if anybody listening here is aware, but just on the issue of people, transsexuals, it's something like 80% of people who identify as transsexuals have mothers that have cluster B personality disorders, right? So these are pathologies. Cluster B personality disorder is a pathology. How do you get that pathology? By improper socialization. So you can see what I'm talking about. If I had allowed myself to be had a missocialization as a child, if I hadn't actively worked against it to make, I would probably have ended up with one of these mental pathologies that so many of my, let's say, other people who are X2 by 2s or 2 by 2s have. And I would probably then inflict my pathology onto my own children, which, like I'm telling you, that's why you have these young X2 by 2 children who think they're trannies, right? It seems, but and there's a host of other things that we could talk about, but it's really these pathologies start in the childhood of these people in this two by two experience, and it can be manifest even 2 or 3 generations later because of the behavior set, unless you, as a child in there, actively seek to avoid the ostracization or the lack of inclusion in your peer group as a child. And that requires enormous amount of, like, let's say, second order or third order thinking to understand your situation and to proactively combat it, right? It's very easy to just go with the flow. And that's what I think most of the people I knew growing up who were two by two children, they just went with the flow. They didn't do what I did. And I really wasn't interested in explaining to them what I was doing. I didn't want anything to do with them. I didn't want to have their mental disorder, their mental problems, right? That's the key. It's very difficult as a child to start thinking in such a proactive manner, to think about these effects. And I didn't really understand, of course, the socialization impact and how it manifests in a pathology at the time. No, I didn't. All I understood was I want to fit in. I don't want to be ostracized. I don't want to be picked on. How am I going to achieve that? If that means I have to distance myself emotionally from my parents, so be it. The number one thing is not being picked on, not being ostracized. You can ask most children. Actually, any children will tell you the number one thing for them is to be accepted by their peers. And the same for me at that age. And I actively achieved it. Now, it's very if you don't know how to do that, or even if your parents are working against you, which is what two by two parents are doing, it's difficult, very difficult. Anyways, I think this is an important insight to understanding the two by two mindset and how it impacts, and why I think there's some, let's say, confusion or disconnect between myself and many other X2 by 2s, because I really don't know any other X2 by 2 that has the same childhood experience that I had, that did what I did, that you know actively distance themselves from the two by two at such an early age 7, in fact, is when I started basically. So that set me on a totally different path than them. And I think that's part of the reason why we have some disagreement amongst myself and many other X2 by 2s.